Hello everyone and welcome to week 6 discussion. I want to take a moment before I get started and thank everyone for their discussion comments for week 5. I think we had an interesting discussion and I want to thank everybody for participating. As I mentioned last week, we're sort of going back a chapter this week and talking about chapter 14, which is the search for organizational integration. And basically, we're going to be looking at two people, Mary Follett and Chester Barnard. And they sort of were bridging the gap between Taylor's scientific method and the group dynamics that we were looking at last week. And both of them really thought about how the group is bigger than its parts. And so that's sort of the main discussion points for today. We're going to start our discussion with Mary Follett. She was born in 1868, and actually her first interest was not business, but political science. While she was a political science philosopher, she became very interested in the Gestalt movement, which is the idea that the whole is greater than its parts. And that's something that will be reflected in some of her ideas about business. She was an early advocate for participative management, and she was a bit ahead of her time when coming to this. She was alive during a time when women had limited opportunities, but she definitely took full advantage of the opportunities she was given. One of the critiques, though, before we get started, that many people had on her work is that she sort of had this idyllic idea about how things should work. And you'll definitely see that as we go through the discussion today, that it was very, if everybody did exactly what they were supposed to do, things will just work out, which sometimes obviously doesn't happen. While Follett was still a political scientist, she developed this idea that there really were only 4 outcomes to confronting conflict. One, that one side could voluntarily submit to the other side, that there would be a struggle and then one side would be victorious over the other, that there could be a compromise and both sides would not get exactly what they wanted. But she also had this idea that if people had a similar end goal, that there could be an integration, which is basically a win-win situation. And this is sort of an idea that she took forward with her philosophy later on in business. So in 1924, she decided she wasn't going to work in the political science field anymore because she felt like it did not seem like it was really coming to grips with what her current present day problems were, or the problems that she saw in the world, and she felt like the business research could do that better. And again, she was very interested in this idea of confronting conflict. She did not like the idea of bargaining because she felt like the two sides were pitted against each other, but that if the two parties could see their common goal and took the time, that they could actually find something or a resolution to the conflict that both sides would agree with. She also came up with this idea of power with, not power over, and she really believed in the law of the situation, and basically that the authority was with the person with the most knowledge and the most experience in that situation, and that really every kind of conflict, you had to look at that specific situation. and that, people should work together, and that there shouldn't be an underlining hierarchy that one person was over another. She was very much about this idea that, sort of we're all in this together. Follett very much emphasized unity and cooperation. She felt that, the situations most of the time were too complex for there to actually be a central authority, and that the control should be throughout the organization. And again, as I said in the previous slide, that authority should actually be given to the people with the most experience and knowledge, not necessarily people higher up on the organizational chart, and that, leaders should be skilled at coordinating and defining purpose, and that it's not necessarily their role just to tell people what to do. Follett was very ahead of her time. She really, even though the critics say that, she felt that she looked at the world in a very idyllic way, she was actually very forward-thinking in how she thought about management and employee relations. The second person that we're going to discuss is Chester Barnard, and again, he was born in Massachusetts, but he was born a few years later than Follett. He attended Harvard on scholarship. He spent most of his career working at AT&T and was at one point the president of the New Jersey Bell Telephone Company. He defined organizations as a system of consciously coordinated activities or forces of two or more people. So I think that this is really important. He really thought of organizations as a group. He wrote a book that hopefully some of you probably didn't read all of the book, but excerpts of the book for this week, titled Functions of the Executive. And basically they were an expansion of lectures he had given in 1937. He really, in this book, he really wanted to develop the theory of organizations. And he sort of felt like an organization, the role of the organization was to maintain equilibrium, examine external forces, and analyze functions of the executives. He complained that most research focused on social unrest, and that they didn't really focus on what the organization actually was. So that's sort of where he drilled down on in his philosophies. He felt that organizations are cooperative systems that are made of discrete beings, but humans do not function except in interacting with other humans. So again, the theme throughout Barnard's work is this idea of that, organizations are groups of people who have to interact, and that's really what makes the organization. He liked this idea of effectiveness and efficiency, but he definitely felt that if you were not efficient, you could not be effective. So that one of the roles of the organization was to improve efficiency. He thought that there were three elements of formal organizations. There were the members, there needed to be a willingness to cooperate, and there needed to be a way to communicate. And that the sort of grouping of those three elements is what created an organization. Within formal organizations, there are informal organizations, and Barnard felt like informal organizations were a means of communication, that they often fostered cohesion among members, and that they also were able to protect personal integrity. So Barnard did not think that formal organizations were better than informal organizations. He sort of thought that these two things worked together to create the organization, and that both the formal and the informal organizations needed each other. He had this idea of the acceptance theory of authority, and this is something that is really what set him apart from a lot of people. He did not think that authority resided with the persons of authority, but in the subordinates' acceptance of that authority, or sometimes non-acceptance of that authority. So that's really where he felt the authority lied. That it wasn't something that was offered by management, but something that was given by the subordinates. And he came up with this idea of a zone of indifference, which was the range of orders, requests, or instructions that a worker is willing to accept and carry out without questioning their legitimacy or authority. So basically it meant that it was the instructions that the authority figure could give to subordinates, and they would do it without questioning it. And once the subordinates began to question the authority, you were no longer in the zone of indifference. Hopefully you guys have read the Dubovnik and Justice article about perhaps some of the later regrets that Bernard had on some of his earlier ideas. So, he felt that perhaps some of his earlier work, he overemphasized authority, and that responsibility and accountability were actually more fundamental. I think that it's good to see that, as people evolve and as society and things, move on, that researchers also can perhaps change some of their ideas, even if it is fundamental to what they're known for. So I think that that's something that is really interesting about Bernard, was that he was willing to reassess some of his earlier work. I have here kind of a breakdown of comparing Follett and Bernard. I will give this to Dr. Trimbach, and hopefully maybe he can post it somewhere, just to sort of give you an idea of what the two people were saying and some of their views on organization. Again, both of them were very interested in the group, and they both thought of an organization as a group of people working collectively. And I think that, as I mentioned, that's sort of the bridge between what we discussed last week and Taylor's scientific management. Again, I hope that we have as good discussions as we had last week, and I thank you for listening.